Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode we read a short story and then discuss it. I'm here with Matt and Simone. This is part of a challenge where we wrote a sequel to a story that we've covered in previous episodes on the podcast. Simone, please tell us a little bit about your story.
So it's a sequel to The Vampire Maid by Hume Nesbit. Well, I guess half sequel, half adaptation because it's not exactly the same. Don't really know what to say about it without spoiling it, but I hope you enjoy it.
Here is The Vampire Wife by Simone King. I met her at the writer's retreat, at a time of life when I was certain only of my desire to be alone. I had recently left a difficult long-term relationship, and, as the cliché perhaps went, my intention was to find myself again in my work. In a grief-struck frenzy only days earlier, I had searched for some place, some space, uncluttered by the plans, memories, and self I had made with James. In short, somewhere without phone signal or internet connection, where neither he nor any well-meaning friends could locate me if they tried. Of course, it had to be affordable, and I soon realised I couldn't vanish for too long, because work only let me have 20 days of holiday a year. That had ruled out most of my grander plans of snow-capped mountains or private islands somewhere sunny. The Brunel retreat, then, had been a perfect fit. The website described it as a small, family-run sanctuary located on the edge of the moors, ideal for any creative soul exhausted by the modern world and its demands. I would, I had declared in my final Facebook post, return a new and better person, armed to face my life again with the completed debut novel I had been promising to write for years. My first sightings of the place had only confirmed my hopes. The retreat was formed of a cluster of quaint bungalows and one white stone cottage, all perched on the edge of the cliff. The buildings were surrounded on every side by either the wild moor or the wilder waters crashing against the rocks. It was lovely and free and fierce. I could already fancy myself as one of the Bronte sisters. Weary with travel, I headed for the cottage first, where I knew I would be able to check in and collect my keys. It was the oldest and largest of the buildings. A small bell jangled when I entered. That was where I met her. Ariadne was beautiful in the way of an old fairy tale. Her skin was paper white, and her hair and eyes were as dark as a winter night in the countryside. Her lips were the only colour on her, poppy red, and curled into a smile to greet me from the front desk. She was the opposite in every way to James and the ordinary life I had led. Perhaps that was why I felt my heart quicken at the mere sight of her. She was like a story, like magic. Before I chased myself, I had chased all of those things first. Miss Nesbit, isn't it? She offered me my keys, and our fingers brushed with a spark of electricity. I'm so pleased you could make it. My mother is just attending to another guest. I can fetch her? No, I found my voice and a smile of my own. No, I mean, yes, I am Miss Nesbit, Clara, but there's no need to trouble anybody. I looked down at the key, embossed with the number 3. I'm sure I can find my way. Despite these words, I lingered by the front desk, and her smile grew, like she too was charmed by my reluctance. She watched me with interest, with what I might even have described as hunger. I suppose then that she did not see very many people her own age, and was as desperate for company as I had been to escape it. I cleared my throat. It's, nice to meet you. Ariadne. Our eyes met, and held. Ariadne, I repeated her name like a prayer. She offered me her hand again, and I fumbled with the key and my luggage to take it and shake politely. I knew from the moment I touched her again that I was lost. My knees went weak, my head light. I'd read about the feeling 1,000 times before, but never sensed it myself. Love at first sight, it had to be. It made me doubt that I had ever truly loved James at all, for he had only ever made me feel comfortable, and never like the world might break should I not see him again. In a gesture at once bizarre and endearing, she leaned down to press a kiss upon my knuckles, like I too was a character to be courted. She didn't look away. Shout if you need anything, she murmured, and let go. Clara. I stumbled to my room in a daze. Bungalow 3 was a dainty set of rooms, cosy without being crowded. There was a small living space, dominated by an antique writing desk in one corner, that looked out upon stormy waters. A smaller bedroom was visible through a half-open door, enticing me to slip in, and sink into the white bedsheets to rest a while from my journey. The soothing scent of lavender wafted into my nose from every side. My mind still reeled. I knew, of course, that I had only recently professed a very firm conviction to be entirely by myself. It was important to be comfortable with only one's own company, after all, and to not live in a state of attachment, like being single was the worst possible crime that a person could commit. I did not even have any real reason to believe that Ariadne might have had the same reaction to my presence as I did to hers. Nonetheless, maybe it was the moors and the sea air, with all of their romantic longings, but I knew it could only be fate. Ariadne and I were simply meant to be together. I had booked to stay at the retreat for the full 3 weeks I could have, but by the end of the first 5 days, I knew I could not possibly return to my life and leave Ariadne behind. Ours was the kind of love I had only ever heard songs about, a burning, consuming infatuation that gnawed at me in every moment when my love and I were apart. Every day I abandoned my writing work to follow her faithfully as she went about her duties, and every night alone I dreamt of her. They were strange dreams, dark and lush and bewitching. Ariadne would kiss me beneath the moonlight in the shadow, pressing me upon decadent black silk sheets, at odds with the simple cotton that I slumbered on each night. In dreams or waking, she did not say much, but I felt she understood me better than James, better than anyone ever had. She gave my soul such peace. I resolved to walk at earliest convenience to the nearest town, where they had the phone signal and internet I had wished to leave behind, and advise my employer that I would be away much longer than initially planned. I could tell them I was sick. I was sick, sick with love. It wasn't truly a lie. I had not yet seen Mrs. Brunel, Ariadne's mother, and the retreat's owner, but I could hardly imagine her protesting to my staying longer. I was a paying customer, and surely she could see as well as anyone with eyes could that Ariadne and I were soulmates. She would understand. Each day I could not tear myself away from Ariadne's side long enough to make the trip, and so we fell happily toward greater intimacies together instead. It was on my second week at the retreat that I first noticed the man in the window of Bungalow 1. I had not seen any of my fellow residents during my initial time at the Brunel retreat, but had hardly been concerned by such a thing. I had not come to spend time with like-minded people, but to get away in solitude, which was no doubt what they had all intended too. Then, when I spent time with Ariadne, no one else had mattered enough to cross my mind. The man in the window looked like he should have been young and handsome, and had indeed been once, but was now wraith-like, withered, and wasting away in the grip of some terrible illness. He stared out endlessly, first one day, and then the next, and the one after that. His gaze fixed upon the central cottage, where Ariadne often stayed. If she should emerge from the building, his fierce eyes would track her every step, like a hound scenting blood, until she had disappeared once more from his view. The attention prickled uneasily down my spine, as did the way his attention would catch on me when I was with her. Enough so that I eventually asked Ariadne about it. She preferred not to speak of it, but at my insistence eventually confided in me some of the details. "He says he loves me," she said in a hushed voice. "He is quite devoted." "Do you love him?" Jealousy, hot as a firebrand, stamped instantly across my chest. She turned her fathomless eyes to me, and I slumped. Of course she didn't. I was ashamed to have thought it, to have doubted us. She continued. "I fear he loves me so much that he would rather kill me than be separated from me when his time comes." "He's threatened you?" I squeezed her hand, furious now on her behalf. "Does your mother know?" Ariadne smiled, gently, as if to reassure me again that everything was all right. "He has no strength in his bones any more. He cannot harm me. He can barely move at all." I knew she was putting on a brave face and must surely be terrified, and so I loathed my fellow resident for scaring her, for watching her, like he didn't see that Ariadne didn't want him, like he didn't see that she was mine. I imagined confronting him, telling him to leave Ariadne alone, but as our conversation carried on, Ariadne was quick to beg me not to cause a scene. It would only cause trouble with her mother. He was a resident, after all, a paying guest. She could not drive him away. The thought made me sick. Upon her advice, however, I promised to keep my distance from Bungalow 1. Yet, something about the man's stare, his desperation to feast on even a glimpse of my beloved, tugged at me. It was probably because strange dreams continued to haunt my sleep, growing only more disturbing each night, until I began to start each day languid and dazed. It was easy to concoct all sorts of mad theories and anxieties about him in my growing delirium. As my third week at the retreat approached, with my still not having made it to the nearby village to extend my trip, I began to picture him left behind with Ariadne, while cruel circumstance endeavoured to draw me away. Fear for my beloved's safety, therefore, led me to break my promise to her. I had to know for myself that he would be no danger to her in my absence. Ariadne was a vibrant creature, for all of her quietness, and I could well envisage his ghoulish, grasping attentions reaching to suck her dry. I left my own bungalow shortly before bedtime, crossing the short distance towards his in the dim light. The wind howled in my ears like a wolf to the full moon. The lights in the cottage were out. The man was not at the window. I knocked but received no answer, and soon found that the door was unlocked. My heartbeat quickened. Had he stumbled out, enraged, and driven insane by the sight of Ariadne and me together? My mind flashed back to his mad face, his ever-present watching. I could well picture it. I let myself in, my feet creaking on the floorboards, and squinted to adjust to the gloom. The man sat propped upright in bed, his expression contorted in silent horror. Ariadne leaned over him. Her soft lips latched at his throat in a vicious mockery of lovers' intimacy. Her free hand brushed away the tears rolling down his face. He did not seem able to speak, but his eyes slid to mine over Ariadne's delicate shoulder. His mouth quivered, soundless around a word. Run. No, not run. Please. Please, please, please. My breath hitched. Ariadne caught the sound and straightened, half turning to look at me also. Her face was so pale it seemed to glow, and her gaze had never seemed so dark before. I had once imagined them to be like a deep pool of water, but I knew in that instant that it wasn't true. Ariadne's eyes were as dark as death. Clara, she smiled, the same gentle and enchanting smile as always, stained with blood. You promised not to cause a scene. You promised not to come here. My legs refused to move. My lungs refused to fill with air. She let go of the stranger, letting his head loll back against the pillows, and stepped towards me. I stumbled back. I knew the word, but it felt absurd to say it aloud, even then. Vampires are a story for the fireside, a literary symbol, a fiction. My head felt fuzzy. I did not know if it was panic, sleeplessness, or a monstrous love. Beneath the horror, I felt the first swell of grotesque fascination. Her teeth were sharp. I realized it might have been the most real thing I had ever seen from her. I realized how often I had babbled about myself, telling her my secrets and dark desires that I had never shared before, while she listened and told me nothing of herself in turn. It had said nothing about vampires on TripAdvisor. Am I him? I asked numbly. I had known Ariadne to be my fate from the moment we met, but was that fate to husk myself? To grow weak so that Ariadne could be strong and I eventually die? Would I be the girl sitting in the window of Bungalow 3, staring after the nightmare I had loved, watching history repeat itself? Did you ever love me? I asked, next, and that hurt more. Of course, Ariadne's smile faltered. She stopped in front of me. You are so warm, so full of strength. You make me feel alive. How could I not love you like life itself? I swallowed. I love all of you, Ariadne murmured and cradled my jaw. You are my tired ghosts, so eager to leave your lives behind and fall in love with your own ending. She pressed her bloodied mouth to mine in a kiss. It is a pity you did not keep your promise. I waited to fall out of love with her. I waited for the spell on me to end, because it must have been some kind of spell to have anyone fall so swiftly. Somewhere, inside me, my spirit flailed like a butterfly, twitching, pinned to a corkboard. The drowsy, thralling pleasure of her company remained. It drowned me, eroded me like the cliffs, shrinking beneath a millennium of waves. I swayed on my feet. The man on the bed sucked in a ghastly, wheezing breath, dry as bone. I did not even know his name. Will you kill me? I asked. One day, she replied sweetly, but not yet. Please, please, please. I met the stranger's eyes, fear-ravaged, furious. He did not stare in infatuation. He stared because he wanted Ariadne dead for what she was. You still love me, she stroked my cheek, don't you? I nodded in the way that Bluebeard's wives must have thought about nodding, when they too opened doors despite all promises. Please, please, please. I did not want to die, not yet. Let me introduce you to my mother, she said. I met her at the writer's retreat, at a time of life when I was certain only of my desire to be alone. I was often alone after that, in our quiet corner of the moors. I took bookings and sent emails and made sure that everything was just so. I did the things that a half-dead girl could not. I never wrote a novel. With time, we no longer loved each other as we once did, but I still introduced myself as Mrs. Brunel. I had long since learnt the script by then. If she was not my wife, then Ariadne was to be my daughter, for I gave her life. I looked after her. She said it was the neatest explanation for why a woman of middle age would be living alone with one so young. The Brunel retreat had been family-run for centuries. She had 100 fathers, so to speak, a line of young men buried in the back garden who gave their lives to sustain the heart which had so ensnared them. I asked her if any of them had ever got away. She told me there was one, a long time ago, when she was newly born. Only one. I knew there would be a time when she would be in search of another wife. Ariadne would claim some pretty thing, whose soul could be stolen with a kiss, and who would be left calm by the end, in the way that only a soulless creature could be. My guests always told me that I gave them such a sensation of rest. There was little left to disturb my waters any more. In the meanwhile, I stayed. The front door jangled with a small bell. I heard her name on their lips, like a prayer. Ariadne. Right, so the Vampire Wife, let's talk about it. Why did you choose the Vampire Maid to write a follow-up story to out of all the stories that we've looked at this podcast?
So there were a few reasons. Reason 1 is I love vampires. Reason 2 is I love femme fatales. And reason 1 and 2 would probably have been enough of an excuse on its own because femme fatale vampire. But I also thought that the Vampire Maid story in particular had a lot of room for a sequel because it's quite open-ended and there's a lot about the world that isn't explained but which I was curious about. For example, the character of Ariadne and what happened to her after the events of the story and what her deeper motivations and personality were because they were never really tapped into in the original. I don't know, I just thought there was a lot of interesting bones to gnaw on in that story and a lot. It's really not very restrictive. You could have gone in so many different directions for it, so it was an interesting one.
Yeah, so she with Ariadne because really she's just
generic vampire
in the role of monster.
Yeah. Generic beautiful monster. Yeah, so it's kind of begging for someone to give her a personality slightly.
I guess in the original story we're just limited to what the narrator says. He's kind of not very helpful because he's under a curse for most of it.
You could say the same about this sequel.
I like the way that you did this, actually, because it's a lot of fun. Your protagonist has a real energy to them, and you can afford to be a little bit blunt because you're like, oh, she's under a spell. So you just come out and say things, and it's kind of funny, but it doesn't feel out of place. I think it adds some heart to the story.
The instant, we're in love. She's my soulmate.
Yeah, it's almost comical, but it fits, and it gives it that kind of soul to the story, which I think was true in the original as well. It had this element of joyfulness in it, and I think you've managed to capture that quite well.
Oh, thank you. This is a good time to ask what you guys thought of the sequel, rather than solely interrogating me.
Oh, I liked this because it had a nice humour to it. I loved the contrast of kind of the almost old-fashioned prose, especially at the beginning, that kind of dumped in references to TripAdvisor and stuff like that. To me, that was very funny.
I did think of you when I wrote that line.
And I really liked the ending. I thought the ending was great. I love the callback to the original story.
Thank you. I found the ending difficult. I had quite a few in mind because, again, fairly open-ended on what you can do. I just knew I didn't want it to be exactly the same as the original, because otherwise what's the point?
Yeah, in the original where he just gets away.
Yeah. Like, Ariadne, don't be such a pathetic excuse for a vampire. Do something.
I like that you changed a little bit. You put your own stamp on it, and you built some atmosphere as well. Like the guy who's just staring out the window is kind of creepy, and just the descriptions of Ariadne herself as well were quite good. There's a lot to like.
Thank you.
I guess my next question then is, what were the easiest or hardest things to emulate about Nesbit's style?
The easiest thing was probably the descriptions, not least because I could copy some of them and use them again in slightly different ways, because he's quite vivid in how he describes the moor, its surroundings, and Ariadne herself, so there was a lot to draw on there. So that's probably the easiest. The hardest was probably his complete lack of dialogue, which killed me. And which ultimately was too hard because I gave up and had to include dialogue. I'm sorry, Hume Nesbit, but no. And so the second hardest part was probably the quite formal first-person way of writing, because it's just so different to my natural way of writing. And I suppose that covers the lack of dialogue as part of a larger umbrella. I'd also never actually written first person before, so that was an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether you did first person very much, because I didn't remember you doing it.
No, I've literally never done first person. It's not my go-to. Like, I think I tried it a few times as, over the course of the years, thinking, hey, I should try first person. And every single time I ended up in a kind of monologue where there was too much thought and not enough action or anything else going on, because I just get stuck in the character's head too much. So in that sense, doing it for sequel challenge was really useful, because it kind of provided me a structure on how to do it without kind of tangenting too much.
It's a different beast when you have that really close perspective. You get a lot from it. Like, you can do some cool things with the character voice, and it builds sympathy towards the character quite well. But it is more difficult, I think, because you have to properly think about your character and everything that you write.
But I also don't think this particular story would work in third person because of the whole kind of vampire glamour, falling in love type of curse. Because if you're doing that from third person, it really doesn't. You have to either criticize the character for being dumb enough to do it, or sympathize, or it just doesn't work.
You need the unreliable narrator, which is very much a first person thing.
Yes.
Right?
I agree, it's definitely a first person kind of story. I don't mind first person. I've used it quite a few times, and
I think romance, usually I would lean towards first person.
Really?
Because
Interesting.
I think so, because it leans quite a lot on the character dynamics and how they're feeling, and how the characters interact with each other, which I think kind of fits first person quite well. It can be difficult if you have really strong emotions involved to play around those in first person, because it can be hard to confront those in such a tight perspective. But yeah, I think first makes sense.
See, for me, I think the issue with first is that it always assumes a certain reader projection into the role of the protagonist, and to a certain extent the reader will always kind of project onto the protagonist because they're our self within the novel. But with first person in particular, if their protagonist is doing something I don't agree with, the I starts to really bug me and offend me, because I'm just like, I would never do that. A weird quirk perhaps of my brain. So a romance in first person just almost, I find bizarre. I'd rather be watching it from a slight distance and then get more into it because of that than have the implication of the I.
I think I'm the other way. I like some of my favorite authors use I pretty much all the time in their books, because I like to put myself in as the character and imagine what they're doing and why. I don't really think about what I would do. I'm in that moment, I'm that character, and I'm about what they're doing, which is also probably a very strange way to read, but it works well for me, especially if I like the character and I find them compelling. It's kind of cool, and it's good for escapism.
There are a lot of very popular first person narratives, except whenever I look back at them, I'm always like, what do you mean that was in first person? Because my brain just blocks it out. I think of everything as being in third person, and then I look back and it's like, oh god, it was in first person. Wow.
Still trips me up sometimes. I'm like, what should I write this story in, first person or third person?
It's an interesting one because, as you said, there's benefits to both and cons to both.
If you want a really good resource on this, Orson Scott Card's Character and Viewpoint, that book, I think it's part of a larger book, I can't remember, but there is one just called Characters and Viewpoint. It's really good. It goes into a lot of detail on the pros and cons of each different perspective.
It's always an interesting one to consider, because particularly if you're quite an instinctual writer, you might just start your story without thinking about the POV, and then it would actually change your story quite a lot if you did think about the POV and change it depending on what you needed.
Yeah, it's something I tend to think about a lot more than I used to, and I think it's important to make the right decision before you write the story.
And to be aware of what they are, so you're not accidentally shifting different POVs, because I think a lot of people can accidentally shift between third person limited and third person kind of omniscient, for example, because they just kind of view it all as third person.
I mean, there's a sense in third person that you can kind of vary narrative distance a little bit, but what you don't want to be doing is head hopping and just jumping between characters a lot, because it gets confusing unless you specifically written the story for that purpose.
I suppose in that sense, the first person helps you keep a lot stronger track on that, but then you have to be careful not to accidentally write something that the character would never think or know.
Why is it so important for you to have dialogue in the stories that you write?
Because dialogue is interesting and it's immediate, which is where, to me, a lot of the tension in a scene comes from, because you're immediately there and you're watching this kind of go between the two characters in the most direct way possible. And I just find that interesting, because dialogue, you can both say things very openly that the characters are thinking, but there's inherently a level of subtext often to dialogue, which gives the readers a lot of room to draw their own conclusions. So, I don't know, I just love dialogue. If a story has no dialogue, I tend to kind of find it really difficult to get into it.
Yes, because you like the communication between the characters and the way they bounce off each other.
Yeah, like I always say that I don't have favourite characters, I have favourite dynamics. Like, I live for the way characters zing off each other. Like, a character on their own is interesting, but it's how the characters relate to other characters within a novel that really gets me, and will always decide if something's my favourite book versus just, yeah, I liked it.
Do you have like a favourite example? Sorry to put you on the spot.
So, popular example is Lady Darga's Shadow and Bone series. So she's got a lot of great characters within itself. Like, she's good at writing characters. Her villains are great. I just love them. Same with the sub, for that matter. But the characters on their own aren't anywhere near as interesting as what they want from each other, because that's what drives the plot, ultimately, and all of the tension. It's not what these characters are doing in a vacuum, it's what they're doing with each other. And I think the same can be said of stories in general. A character on its own is a vacuum. A character in a group, well, that's where you get all of the fighting and all of the conflict and all of the emotional kind of warmth and everything else that kind of makes up the lifeblood of the story. Like, a character just on their own, there's something sad about it. Lonely.
There aren't many books with just one character, but I think most of them that are quite sad. Who's had that quote where get a second person in the room as soon as possible?
Yeah.
Do you know the one I'm thinking of?
I don't, but it sounds like an excellent quote. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Because, like, ultimately, it's another character who's going to be able to come up with their own plans and have agency.
Yeah. You want some sort of conflict, so you need usually another person.
Yeah, and that's not to say that all conflict requires another person. Like, you can have larger forces, like, fate or nature, or... Like, I think people are ultimately obsessed with how people deal with people. It's at the heart of everything we do.
Because it's so bloody confusing. Fiction, help me!
Yeah, in short, that is why I like dialogue, because it gets to the crux of that. It's people talking to each other, and people talking to each other is them trying to either solve a problem or start a problem. So
I think, yeah, so we kind of mentioned this between ourselves, but you've taken quite a different route to the challenge to Matt. He kind of added on to the plot of The Mask. You've kind of taken the same plot as the original story and adapted it for like a more modern era.
She's changed the time and the characters, right?
time, characters, ending.
What led you to take that route?
I mean, on a very basic level, when I first read the story, I immediately wanted to know what the bad ending was, where the narrator didn't escape and Ariadne won. Like, I don't know, she's a murderous vampire, but I found her interesting, and I guess I was a little sympathetic to this creature who had everyone madly in love with her despite not really saying a word to them throughout the entire story. And, like, even if that is a vampiric glamour, there's something really sad about that. Like, to go back to the whole one person on their own is lonely. Like, to a certain extent, if you're mentally controlling everyone around you, that's lonely. You're not actually connecting with them. And then the contemporary element came because I started wondering if it was even possible to do the same story in a contemporary way, given the difficulty of, like, one, getting away from people in a lot of our modern lives at the moment. Like, I don't know, the world these days feels smaller. Typically, you can't just vanish somewhere as easily as you would because of the internet. Like, even if you go somewhere that physically has no people, that doesn't disconnect you from them. And then there's the enormity of vampire mythos in popular culture, so could you actually get away with having someone meet a vampire and having the same reaction of, oh my god, it's a vampire?
I mean, one character is going to be more aware of what a vampire is because of their presence in popular culture. Did you like think about that when you were writing the story, or how did you use it?
I mean, a little bit in the sense that, like, I tried to keep a few touches in that, like, the protagonist's disbelief that vampires are actually real when she learns about Ariadne. Beyond that, I considered a version of the story where someone was trying to investigate the disappearances of the vampire, or like maybe someone who's really obsessed with the vampire myth and had learned about all of these people going missing on the moors. And then ultimately I decided not to do that, but it did cross my mind because it's something to consider when adapting to a more contemporary audience. I think ultimately there's something appealing, isn't there, about the idea of the not knowing. Like, even though the reader knows, but then the reader knows in the original as well because it's in the title.
Yeah, and you kind of use this. I think you use like a similar dramatic irony that the reader knows something isn't right. There's a strange man hanging around, and suddenly the narrator begins with, I don't really want to be in love," and then suddenly she's head over heels. You kind of know something's up.
But at the same time, when I was thinking about the contemporary, I was kind of thinking about how often you do meet people who are very suddenly in love when they meet someone new. Like, it's both weird and also a part of our culture to have love at first sight.
Yeah, I guess it's something that happens in quite a lot of love stories and maybe in real life. I've never experienced it, so I don't know.
I've never experienced it personally, but I have met people who are like, oh, I love him, or like, oh, I met this new person I'm so excited about. And it's like, oh, it's them and their latest person. Like, I wouldn't necessarily think, oh, they're under a vampiric curse.
I mean, I might, but that's just because I'm strange. Like, well, I mean, vampires could be real. It's not been disproven.
That's not.
It's pretty hard to prove something doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. Like, there's always that question, isn't it, when you adapt something, of how much do you want to be inspired by something versus directly adapt it, versus what are you taking from your world? Is it a different world? Like, there's hints that, Hume Nesbit's world is basically our world with vampires, but given he doesn't give enough details, I could totally go into a fantasy world which happens to have, like, a London or something, and, it wouldn't actually contradict the original at all.
Okay, so what aspect did you have the most fun with when you wrote this?
Ariadne. I'm sorry, I just love her and her creepy love glamour. Like, my normal go-to is very much often slow burn, so it's really fun just starting with the premise of, oh yeah, okay, love at first sight. It's just alien to me, but so much fun. And also, there's just something about beautiful vampires on the moors. It's very gothic and kind of gay, which is the other reason I wanted a female protagonist. But anyway, I know there's just something about vampires I find it really hard to ever imagine them being completely straight. Don't know what it is. I think it's a symbolism for our history. But anyway,
Can you explain that a bit more?
it might be just because they're so often queer coded, like, or I don't know. I've just read stories like Carmilla where it's got the kind of femme fatale vampire. So you almost assume they've got kind of some tension with anyone they meet to a certain extent, particularly if they do have the love glamour. So it's, particularly in Ariadne's case, I'd find it really strange to just imagine her having no reaction at all if it was a guy versus a girl. I don't know. I guess they're like the epitome of desire, aren't they, as a creature? Hedonism. So it's really strange to me to imagine that as being tied by something like sexuality.
Why do you think the vampire comes back into fashion so often?
I think it's because they're so versatile and simple. I kind of think of them as the everyman of monsters. Like, other than the blood drinking, which is repeating parts that makes them a vampire, there have been so many different takes on their mythos that you can basically repurpose them for pretty much any genre at this point. Like, they can be ugly or beautiful, terrible or tragic. You can do whatever you like with them, which means that if you want a monster, the vampire is kind of always there for you.
Well, also it's incredibly useful to be able to use something in your story the audience has prior knowledge of, because you can assume that they have an understanding of what a vampire is and the general rules surrounding them, which saves you so much time on exposition if you were to make up something new.
Yes. My pet peeve of fantasy stories, doing the world building of like magic systems. Oh my god.
With vampires, it could be as simple as just throw some garlic at them and you'll be fine. I do like that in every work their weaknesses vary. You don't know, like, what are these vampires vulnerable to? What can they see? Can they see their reflections? Can they go inside if they're not invited in? It's always fun. It's always fun to see where the limits are.
Yeah, you just don't see that with as many other of the mythic creatures. Like, the limits tend to be more drawn on them in a way that they're not for vampires.
Yeah, I guess essentially because vampires are so superhuman that you have to do something, or they just rule the world.
Exactly.
It's strange that there's lots of weird superstitions around them. Like werewolves, you're like, oh, full moon, kill them with silver, whatever, right? Vampires have got so many different things. You have to invite them in. They can't go over running water. They're not in mirrors. It's just endless.
Yeah. And Hume Nesbit doesn't really go into any of that on his story. Beyond, that she can turn into a bat. Which I chose to ignore, but anyway. Because that's just a weird mental image.
I just think they're sexy monsters. People like them.
I mean, not that people haven't done them hideous, but also nowadays they do very much lean into beautiful, which also, will admit appeals to my shallow sensibilities.
And mine. Okay, so what have you learned from doing the sequel challenge, and have you got any tips for anybody who might want to do something similar?
I was reminded that writing is very hard, but it is a fun way to stretch your writing muscles and try doing something different, or to try a different style to normal, because it does give you a template to copy. I would say probably don't be afraid to put your own stamp on it, because after all, even if it is a sequel, you're the one writing it, so I think it should still have a you element, or what's the point of you writing it up to a certain point? Like, ultimately, I'm never going to be Hume Nesbit, so up to a certain point, as much as I can try and emulate him for fun and kind of copy his writing style, don't want to be him. Also, his lack of dialogue.
Okay, I was just gonna say, do you think it's useful to pick an author to imitate when you admire something about their work, to see if you can play with it and bring it into your own?
Yes, because you do not want to pick writing that you hate to try and copy, because it will drive you insane. Like, you're just not going to successfully copy something that you look down on, are you? Like, from a very practical standpoint, but also as a way of learning writing. Sometimes you can pinpoint what it is that you really like about someone's writing by examining it closely, and trying to do a sequel is one way of examining writing very closely. Yeah, so I was going to say, you guys have read a fair amount of my normal writing style. Did it feel Hume Nesbit-y, or did it still feel me?
The first page was pretty Hume Nesbit, and then soon as your main character opened their mouth, I was like, oh, it's Simone.
Oh, damn it.
Yes.
Curse
Yes.
the dialogue. It gets me again.
You blew your cover.
Ugh.
100% agree with that.
I thought I had Hume Nesbit down. I really have no control over that. Okay, interesting. Something to work on, because...
I mean, there were glimpses of it later on, but the start was so definitely Hume Nesbit that when it then shifted towards your style, there was no going back, right?
Ugh, damn. Oh well, not too bad for a first attempt, to be fair.
I thought your style meshed pretty well and I didn't really mind it. I quite liked it.
Yes, to be honest, even though it did shift towards your style, that was also the part where I started enjoying the story, so...
But did you just hate the first page then? Well,
No,
I mean,
didn't
the first
hate
page
it, but
is exposition, isn't it? So it's not the most interesting of the lot anyway.
I thought it was fine, but as soon as the dialogue started, it really came to life, and I'm like, yeah, this is obviously because this is what Simone likes writing, and it's what she's good at, so it makes sense.
I don't know how people write stories without dialogue. One day I will try it, I'm sure, but I don't understand. Why would you not include dialogue?
Well, I mean, really, it's just a very specific kind of action. You can just have other actions.
You can, but Hume Nesbit has dialogue in the sense he writes about them talking, he just doesn't write the conversations.
I mean, that's usually done when you want to keep it brief and be very quick, but it's definitely out.
Cool. That's the end of my questions. So, anything else anybody would like to ask or say?
Obligatory mention of I Am Legend, because I haven't mentioned it enough times yet. Go read it.
Oh, yeah. Your favourite vampires, right?
Yes, the whole book is about what you said earlier, where you're trying to figure out which vampire rules apply in this story. That's what the main character is doing in I Am Legend.
Did you feel that Ariadne's motivations fit for her, or did they feel a bit clunky?
I mean, they felt fine to me.
I mean, it's a bit strange in that a lot of the story is motivated by the fact that she's been kind of possessed. So in that sense, it's not really her motivations at that point.
True.
What I got from it was that she just wanted to stay alive.
I mean, fair. Pretty much.
I think that's kind of understandable. I'd also like to stay alive.
It's true.
She didn't feel like she was overly cruel. She just felt like, I don't know, she was doing what she needed to do and that she was a vampire and that's just the way it rolled for her.
I mean, similar to the original, because she didn't have that much, sadism in the original either. She just kind of feeds on him when he's sleeping.
Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. Thanks to Simone for letting us look at her story this episode. Really enjoyed it.
So you can read more of my work on themoderntypewriter.tumblr.com.
Cool. So we'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.